Well, welcome everyone to our Friday 5 Live. We are so thrilled to have all of you listening in today with us, as well as Jessica Tinklenberg, who's going to talk with us about supporting our students in this continued unusual time of educational challenges. I think I'll just try to put it nicely like that. Just a couple of housekeeping items. If you're joining us, please do make sure you we love our audience questions. We love audience interaction. So please do use the chat functionality and just make sure that you're responding to everyone so we can all see your questions, or if you'd like to introduce yourself and tell us where you're from. We always have folks from all over listening in, which is always so exciting for us. I've put today's slides there in our chat function as well, so you have access to those. I do want to highlight, I thought, a nice kind of connecting point to our conversation today. We've got an upcoming complimentary webinar on the 11th with Amy Baldwin around supporting our students as they overcome failure. And so I think that ties nicely into today's conversation. So just so you know who I am, my name is Meg Foster. I've spent the last 20 years working in higher education in a variety of different capacities, orientation, supporting online learners, first year experience, and I work at Piedmont Virginia Community College, where I teach FYE courses and serve as an academic coach. But I am delighted to have today Jessica Tinklenberg with us from Claremont Colleges. Jessica and I connected via one of those wonderful listservs, which can be such great resources, I think. And Jessica really, clearly has an incredible resume. She has spent a number of years, just a few, as an award-winning teacher, teaching kind of at all levels, and now you're helping prepare faculty to have success in the classroom. So we're going to spend our focus today really kind of talking about what's come out of 2 years of pandemic learning. One of the comments that came through, I think it was it on the pod listserv, Jessica? Feel free to.
Yes, I think so. Yep.
And if you're not familiar with pod, I think that's just anybody can sign up for their listserv. And I find that a really robust set of resources around challenges that we're kind of all facing in the world of higher education. And again, that's, I'll put that in the chat. It's pod, P-O-D network. So out of the pod network, there came this conversation about students who are not being successful, and kind of some surprise around that, right? I think there was sort of this general assumption that fall semester we were going to be back in person, and that there would be a lift, right? Like, okay, maybe it's not normal. We're still shifting to whatever the new normal is, but it's going to be better that we're more in person. And the surprise kind of came out of this discussion that people were not seeing that they were continuing to see high rates of DF and W grades. And I know I certainly have experienced that, unfortunately, in the classes I've been teaching this academic year. So, as always in our Friday 5 Live, we've got some questions to guide our discussion. I've assured Jessica this is just really a conversation between two colleagues. Jessica is amazing. So feel free to put your questions in our chat today too, and we'll make sure, I'll make sure we weave those in. But just to kind of kick us off, Jessica, we talked about there just kind of seem to be these surprises about this sort of return to in-person. Kind of what do you think is going on there? Why do you think this is the case, and what's kind of the heart of those issues?
Yeah, I think what I've been hearing from students and what I've been hearing from my colleagues is that there was this misapprehension that somehow after 1 year or 2 years, however long we did pandemic teaching remotely and then sort of hybrid or in person, that somehow there would be this return to normal. And that really didn't take into account. I know it was wishful thinking, because especially for those of us who've been teaching for a while, we found such joy in that classroom experience before COVID, and a lot of us, really delighted in that face-to-face experience because that was the one that we had to, and so we wanted that back, but we failed to pay attention to, I think, for one thing, the incredible emotional cognitive, right, workloads for both ourselves and our students of getting through these past 2 years. And those have a lasting impact. A lot of our colleagues are talking right now about the way that we can be trauma informed, trauma aware in our teaching. And what we see when we look at what's happened these last 2 years is that there has been a lot of trauma that we haven't really had a chance to work through, think about, right? And I think we know it as educators, like we have the same kind of feeling. I regularly see in my Twitter feed and on the pod listserv and other places, faculty saying, I thought this was going to be a better semester, but I'm just exhausted. And that makes sense, actually. Whatever we wished it would look like, that was a misapprehension based on, sort of, like I said, wishful thinking, a desire to go back to something that was good for us. And so I think that just saying, oh, now that we're back to normal, first of all, ignores that past, right? And so expecting things to look like they did in the past, and even in terms of things like DFW rates, that is based on wishful thinking rather than the reality of the past 2 years. And the other thing I think that happened in those past 2 years is that students' expectations of what school was like or what should be like have really shifted. And I think they've rightly shifted, right? I don't think that it's unfair that they have new expectations. For us, we've been teaching a long time and we have this vast experience with a particular kind of learning. But especially for our new undergrads, my daughter is a junior in college this year, my older daughter, and she had exactly 1 semester of uninterrupted face-to-face learning. And she's a second semester junior now, right? I mean, even this last spring, they started for the first 2 weeks online. And so much of their educational experience has not been the same as ours. And so they have different expectations. And I think that we haven't given enough time or space to our students or ourselves to address that sort of passing of expectations, right? That we're not building bridges between what students expect from their learning experiences now, having lived through most of their higher ed experience, perhaps as online learners or hybrid learners, right? Versus our experience of over a longer period of time and our expectations that things would just go back to normal. That creates a mismatch in expectations that I think we're not talking about. And I think that that's why we're seeing a lot of that, like what students need, what they expect, is very different than what it might have been 3 years ago. And if we're not addressing that, of course they're not going to be successful, right? That the educational situation is not meeting their needs, and it's certainly not meeting ours.
Yeah. Wow. And I'm thinking, because of the nature of the work we do, whether we're at a 2-year institution or at a 4-year institution, I don't know why I had not paused to think about this, Jessica, but we are quickly going to run out of students who know what normal higher education looks like. Does that make sense? Like, like there isn't going to be that shared, oh, you and I had kind of a similar experience, even though we may be 20 years apart, in our higher educational journeys. There was always that kind of commonality. Oh, you went into a lecture hall and a faculty sat, and that shared experience really has permanently shifted. And I think you bring up such a good point that I've heard resonate in every one of the Friday 5 Live conversations we've really had in the last 2 years, but particularly we've done several with student panels, and they've talked a lot about, there is no normal, and they get very frustrated when faculty and administration want to use that, oh, we're returning to normal. And because you're right, that completely dismisses the last several years of their lives. But I'm curious if you've seen any institutions that you feel like are doing good work around giving space to process, to do. I mean, this is it's grief, it's loss, and And I know I got to work this week with Naomi Sig, who's at Case Western Reserve, and they had set aside time at the end of last spring semester to sort of have a university-wide day of reflection and sort of mourning, for lack of a better term. But I haven't heard that at a lot of other institutions. And I feel like that's really an important missed opportunity if we're not doing that kind of work and providing that kind of space. So I don't, anything you've seen out there that you're like, oh, here's a way that we can kind of carve out some of that space to do that?
Yeah, I mean, I've certainly seen it on the individual classroom level in a lot of places. So the Claremont Colleges system is 7 institutions, right? So we have 5 undergraduate colleges and 2 graduate universities. And as I meet with faculty and we talk about how to respond to the past 2 years and to make learning environments that are productive for students, I see a lot of that in the individual classroom level. Institutionally, I would just give a shout out to our California community colleges, because they are like frontline on this, really making sure that they're using trauma-informed principles to guide every aspect, right? Things like advising, first-year advising or continuing advising, re-enrollment. A lot of students, especially in the California community college system, had to drop out because of family needs that they had, right? And other kinds of like cost of living kinds of things. And so now they're working really hard in the California community college system to re-enroll those students and to draw them back in and say, you know, whatever happened in the past, if you had to drop out, it's okay. We're going to make this work. This is a path for you to get to success. And I think that institutionally, they're doing a great job of really making it clear to students the value of that education and giving them a pathway, even if, you know, they didn't have the best grades early or pre-pandemic, that's not a barrier. So I've been actually just desperately impressed with my colleagues at the California community college system.
That's wonderful to hear. Yeah, because I think that's been so, we had a chance to talk to University Milwaukee, and they're doing a lot of work around kind of trauma-informed care in general, like infusing that into the campus culture as a result of the pandemic. And I just so admire that effort to say, we value this, everyone needs to know about this in our institution, and then what could it do to sort of shift the culture at a university. And what's been interesting to look into their work, and it's been written up in the Chronicle a couple of times now, is that it didn't really cost them any money, right? Like it just, they're like, this wasn't like somebody set aside $100,000 or it was part of an accrediting requirement, which I think so many times, you know, big projects come out of those sorts of things. It really was just several people kind of coming together and saying, you know, people have been traumatized, and how do we respond to that in a way that's caring and in a way that helps support people, because ultimately we want our students to be successful. So if we just don't acknowledge it, it seems like we're not setting students up for that kind of success.
I've heard from lots of students that, you know, maybe they don't want to be talking about the past 2 years and the trauma all the time, but they do want to be making spaces that feel like they can still succeed. And that doesn't take any money, right? That just takes an awareness by the faculty member to say, like, we're going to build this space out together. And it's going to allow you to not have to constantly be re-traumatized, right? Like relive and relive and relive by talking about it all the time, but really just to see that it is still possible, that we still believe that if we make the space that you can be successful. And I think that it's actually a pretty easy thing. But like I said, I think our misapprehension about, oh, we'll just go back to normal and everything will be okay, that's really stands in the way of that, rather than really attending to, like I said, being trauma aware, trauma informed in everything that we do.
Do you, sort of as a related question, any resources that you have around kind of becoming trauma aware? I know there are lots of different ones out there, but what would you recommend?
A great book that actually just came out, I think this year. Her last name, Alex Venet, Venet. And it's equity-centered, trauma-informed education, I think is the title, but it's Alex Chevron Venet. And I actually read that with my team this last summer, my CTL team, and we used it as the foundation for our series of workshops in the fall semester with faculty, to sort of put this front and center. That and the other great thing about that book in particular is that Alex really focuses on this idea that being trauma informed is a part of being equity centered, right? That more students will succeed, more students will benefit, a greater number will feel included if we're paying attention to both the strengths and assets they bring to the classroom. Certainly, we don't want to become deficit minded in this way, but also the experiences they bring into the classroom, including experiences of trauma, and that allows us to be more inclusive educators.
I really love that focus. No, strangely enough, I got to the last professional development training in person I did before the pandemic was trauma-informed care, kind of level 1 in the community college system. And it really was, I'm so glad I had that as we made, as the world then became this wholly new thing, because it just has become this sort of foundation upon which I base all my interaction, with my students and my colleagues. So, and it is interesting to think how transformational that can be. And that's sort of the hope in our system, is that, if we were kind of talking earlier, if our future police officers, if our future nurses that we're training in the system sort of have this understanding, what then happens within our larger communities as well. So it becomes a ripple effect, for lack of kind of a better term. Other things that you're maybe hearing, you mentioned, students wanting to have these spaces, but anything else you're hearing from your students about their experiences during COVID and this year of transition that they would want us to know about? And I see this year of transition becoming maybe 2 years of transition.
I have no doubt it will be many, many years.
Okay.
Yeah. I don't want to say that as a downer, but I think that it's a long-term recovery, right, from what we've all been through, and it's got to be slow and steady. So I love this question because I think it points to something that I'm hearing from faculty and from, unfortunately, folks in politics, right, representatives and so forth, is that there was massive learning loss in the pandemic. And I just don't believe that's true. I think our students learned a lot and we learned a lot. It may be a different kind of learning than, again, what we had before the pandemic, but our students, I think when I look at the students I have this year in my first year seminar class versus students I had prior to the pandemic, I see all the time that my students are much more intentional and careful about their mental health. They're much more careful about each other's mental health. They have, this is unfortunately, tragically, this is one of the things that shared trauma does, right? It builds this sort of collective sense. It's helped them to see that they need each other. And they're very committed to making sure that they take care of each other. In a not patronizing, just a really collective kind of communal kind of way. And I think that actually has sparked something else that my students are telling me all the time about what they learned in the pandemic, is that maybe grades and competition for grades is not the most important thing to them anymore. And for folks who are familiar with the Claremont Colleges, they consider themselves elite institutions, whatever that means. But these are, students who have been very successful in the graded system prior to this. And now they're saying, maybe collaborating, building skills at communicating effectively, maybe those kinds of things are more important. And they learned that in the pandemic. And I think that's, again, we're not listening if we're not hearing that from our students as real and deep learning that actually is going to take them, I think, take them very far in the world, and should be valued. And that maybe we need to start thinking about their learning assets, the great things they learn, rather than deficits or losses or something like that. That we should start there. The other thing, I think my students obviously have learned a lot about self-advocacy in the pandemic. And I think that's just an amazing, like I said, life skill, right? That unfortunately came from a difficult and for some very dangerous situation. But to learn how to say, this is what I need. This is actually a question I asked my students, talked with my students about, but also asked my daughters because they're also in college. And
you have your own focus group right there.
Pardon?
Sorry, you have your own focus group, right.
Oh, yes. Yeah, that's right. I thought you said I was out of focus. I was like, okay, it's okay. No. But yeah, that's right. Lots of input from them. But one of the things that they said was that this sense of saying, oh, I can actually ask for an extension, or I can actually advocate that I need these resources. And my students too, a lot around, again, mental health, self-advocacy, a lot around disability advocacy that they didn't feel comfortable before, but now they're seeing the difference it's going to make in their ability to succeed. And I think those are all incredible learnings from students. Maybe not, like I said, maybe not like the kinds of things we wanted them to learn from, first gen chem class, right? That's okay. We, but lots of other things that they're really discovering and learning that are actually going to be quite valuable to their life from here on out.
And I think about, what I know about who are students who are successful, and a lot of my research was around online learners in particular, but that ability to be self-advocates, that's really, really tied to success. And so, and I'm also fascinated, I'm so glad you brought up this idea of kind of students shifting away from a focus on grades. There was a really great piece in Mind Shift, which is KQED's online newsletter about students, high school students who are very academically focused, kind of talking about the last 2 years have sort of redefined how they see themselves, what they value, and that they don't value the grade in the way that they had placed that value before, which I think is incredibly mentally healthy, because I think that's a whole other Friday 5 Live topic right
For
there.
Sure.
And I live with a kid dealing with, being in an academically challenging where there's a hyper focus on grades that's so unhealthy. I mean, just so incredibly unhealthy. And then paired with that conversation, I'm seeing so much on our listservs too about folks really wanting, like faculty wanting to get away from traditional systems of grading, which is revolutionary in a way.
I'm just delighted. It makes me so happy, because I do think if we're real honest with ourselves, very often grades bear no relationship to learning, right? And so as long as we're going to be grading some stuff, it should be it should match as closely to the kind of learning we want to see, right? Mm-hmm. But I think that removing that obsession and that we've built into students, right? This is a thing that we've done to them with grades and grading, frees them up to take feedback better. It frees them up to think about that feedback as not punitive and actually listen to it, right? It gives them the kind of like reflective skills that we also know, like faculty that I know that have limited or removed grading add a lot of reflection, right? Like, what did you learn? Tell me about it. A lot of peer reflection, a lot of faculty conferencing kinds of things, where it's focused on what did you learn and what are you going to do with it? And that kind of forward-focused reflection, we know that that's something that makes long-term learning possible, right? We know that that is the kind of thing that makes it possible for students to succeed. And maybe it doesn't show in a grade, but maybe that's not because they didn't learn, right? But because our grades aren't matching the learning that's going on.
Right. And I think about the importance of, and I know we've gotten a little bit off top. This is the way our conversations work, about that importance of feedback and, you know, chance for students. And unfortunately, what I saw come out of at least K-12 last year and somewhat this year as well is a real lack of feedback. It's here's a grade, but if you have no feedback, how do you grow? Like, if you write a paper and nobody provides you any feedback and all you see is a letter grade associated with it, you then don't know how you can improve your writing. And none of us are. I think communication skills are some of the most important things we teach students, and at a base level. It doesn't matter what you major in, right? I think we all need to be able to graduate with a degree where we can write something that can, you know, is clear, and where you can speak in a way that communicates as well. So I find that lack of feedback, because so much of, I feel like the learning experience in the last couple of years has been kind of transactional. You know, you do this, you get a grade. You do that, you get a grade. And some of that has to do with having to pivot very quick. I get, you know, the challenges with the way that we've tried to figure out learning in the last couple of years, but I really love that focus on the opportunity to reflect.
When I think too, I mean, this is not just a pandemic year's problem, right? Any of us who've been teaching a long time, you know, if we've had this experience of like the paper goes into the grading hole, we put a grade on it, the students don't look at any of the feedback we've given them, because to them it's done, and then they don't learn from it. And then we get another paper from them, they've made the same mistakes because we haven't given them a way to use that feedback. And then we're frustrated, and it creates this sort of animosity between students and faculty, right? Why do I keep getting a bad grade? Well, you're not using the feedback I gave you. Well, you know, why do I have to use the feedback? Well, so you can improve. Like this, it creates this sort of adversarial relationship where I'm frustrated with you as a student, rather than us being on the same team saying like, this is the path we're going to take to make sure that you're really learning these skills that we think are so critical to your success in the world. And actually that comes in terms of, you know, this not having a corresponding lift in grade. I think it does have a lot to do with our lack of transparency about what the grade means. Right. And for students, then, you know, they just see that grade and it just deflates them. And instead of seeing the feedback in places that they can improve and committing to that, and that creates this cycle where they're like, well, I'm always going to be a C student. I'm always going to be a D student. I've gotten 3 Ds in a row. And rather than, you know, this reflective piece that can really help them think in terms of growth and think in terms of success yet to come.
And that's so important to the ability to, you know, stay enrolled. I mean, I think about so many of the students I teach in the community college sector have never really felt successful in a classroom before, because they early on, for whatever reason, they've got it into their mind that they are, oh, I'm just a D student. Like, that's just who I am. I can't do this work. This is, you know, I'm here because I need to be, but that doesn't mean I'm really, and so often that's not the case at all. And it just, so I spend a lot of time, you know, working to kind of undo that, that little voice in their head and try to change that narrative.
Yeah, and it does come from a fundament, like they're K-12 instructors and their college instructors. It comes from our mindset a lot, right? That we have this sort of, well, that person's first paper was good, so, you know, I'm just going to assume that they're already good at this, right? This kind of fixed mindset that we have about our students, rather than being open and helping them see possibilities for themselves. That's a thing that we've done to our students, where they then see in themselves, well, I wasn't good at math in 8th grade, and so I'm just never going to be good at math, right? That's a failure of imagination on our part, I think, to not help them see other possibilities.
Yeah, that's such a good, as we think about, that I think so often the conversations I meant are around fixed mindset with our students, not with ourselves. And that's important, that we look at that too. And I think that's a nice tie-in to kind of this last question around some strategies that you're seeing that faculty and staff can take, and I focus this question, kind of on the now, because I know we're sort of at this urgent point. It's very much make or break time for a lot of our students, but moving into the fall semester as well. And I would also love to hear, as you're thinking about strategies that can support students, I think some of those strategies are ones that, we're focused on ourselves too, and our own growth and our own taking care of ourselves. So any recommendations you have there too would be super welcome.
Yeah, thank you. I think I always say this to anybody who knows me. This is my first answer always to this kind of question is, it's never too late to be more transparent with your students. And so, I like to encourage faculty, instructional staff to build transparency design it from the beginning. But even if you didn't, it's not too late now to look at the assignments that you have left in this semester, the readings that you have left, and ask yourself, why did I assign this, right? What does it contribute to the learning that needs to happen between now and the end of the semester? And if you can't answer the why question, it's time to let that go, right? And if you can't answer how it's related to learning, you may need to make a swap, or redesign, or work with your students. And then ask yourself those questions first, get your mindset right about transparency, but then talk with your students about, hey, this is what we have coming up. And these are the learning goals that we have for this class that we haven't met yet. Which of these things do you think which paper or which assignment is going to best help you meet those learning goals? And why do you think so? And how can we make sure that that's what we're doing? And I mean, you get to make choices that remove things from class, right? As much as cramming more stuff in. We don't need to do that right now at this point in the semester, but we need to be transparent with our students about why. And that goes a long way to actually student success. We know this. There's been lots and lots of studies on the role of transparency in helping students succeed. When they know the why, when they know the how, and when they know how they're going to be evaluated, and why they're going to be evaluated that way, students are more likely to succeed. I mean, it makes just good sense, right? If you are able to communicate why this matters to their education and how to be successful, they're more likely to do the things you want, right? It's like if somebody were to come up to me today and say, Jessica, go write a lab report. Like, I have a PhD in religion, so this is not something I've done.
It's been a while, been a minute.
Yeah, long time. I wouldn't know how to do that, right? And I would not succeed at that, in spite of the fact that I'm pretty well educated. And so, but the same thing for our students who are novices, right? They need that sort of framework, and being transparent about what that framework is really going to be helpful. And the other thing, we've talked about this some, is making some space, right? It doesn't have to be talking about trauma or talking about COVID all the time. That may actually not be effective, but making some space where students can have some relief from that feeling of trauma. Actually, we know this too really improves student success rates. So things like giving students choices. We talked about this a little bit with assignments and transparency. So saying, okay, we have, we at Pitzer have 4 weeks left. Very exciting. Okay, we have these 2 assignments. Which would you like to complete? Which do you think is gonna better show your learning in the class? Giving them some choice. They may not all choose the same thing, but you're not going to be grading all of both of those. So that's good bonus for us too. Giving students some voice, right? Saying, okay, how should we evaluate this assignment to make sure that we're getting at the things that you really learned? That's going to help them both voice what is necessary for success so they know it, but also tell them that you care about their presence in that space, and this couldn't be evaluated well without them. I really like to encourage my students to create back channels for making space where they can ask each other questions and I'm not a part of it, because that I have found is an incredible, I mean, they set up group chats faster than anything I can possibly imagine. Like, it would take me all day to get this, but they're on it. And or Slack channels or whatever they want to do, right? Where they can ask each other questions. That creates a space where it's okay to ask questions, where it's okay to be like, I don't understand, can you help me? And let them be experts for each other. And like that creates a kind of space that is allows them to feel whole and important, rather than, just constantly under the lens of trauma. And then I think making space by jettisoning some things you don't need. It's okay. I'm giving you permission, if you need it, to let some things go. Because if we're honest with ourselves, if we try to cram all that material in, students aren't going to remember it anyway. It's going to give them more opportunities to get failing grades on things only. And you're going to still come into, say it's a first of a series of classes, they're still going to come into that next class and need to do some reminding, right? Anyway, so letting some things go in your content heavy courses might actually make more learning possible and make that learning stick better. So to me, those are transparency and making space in lots of ways for students to have choice and voice.
Great recommendations. And I think about that sometimes when we let things go, there's the chance for a deeper connection with content and with the learning that can be, really powerful. I love this idea of back channels. One of my students early in the pandemic was like, can't you just teach this class via Discord? And I was like, well, no, for two reasons. One, the college, kind of wants us to use the LMS, and two, I'm not cool enough to do that. So, I'm just going to be real transparent with you. I'm not that girl, but I think that's so great to give students that permission, because I think often they feel like they're sneaking around, right? Like, and no, use one another. You all are terrific first resources, and for our students who aren't quite ready for self-advocacy, I think about all the times, even with my own kids, right, where maybe they were too reluctant to ask the question, but a friend was like, no, you need to ask the question. But if I say, ask the question, they're not going to listen to me. They're going to listen to the friend, right? And I think the same happens in our classroom environments too. I've taken 2 pages of notes, Jessica. I just want to let you know, this has been just such, I was so initially excited, just we use that same term, bridging expectations. And I think that when we kind of boil it all down, we're still in this place where we have vastly different sets of expectations, sometimes students to faculty, students to staff. And I think it's important for me to remember that those expectations, and in fact, I think I shared with some folks that, gosh, now 10 or 12 years ago, there was major research done in our community college system that said this very thing, that, students have. But those expectations from 10 or 12 years ago are gone. We're not bridging to that anymore. We're bridging to this whole new thing we're kind of building together in a way. And so there's some excitement, but I think there also is a chance, you're right, that we need to give ourselves the space to kind of mourn what was, right? We're not going back there again. And that's okay, because there can be some really exciting things that can come out of this. I mean, as we've talked about, like sort of the ideas of ungrading, if you will. I know that's not focusing on the grades, the reflection, the opportunities to learn, and also looking at the last 2 years, because much like what you have shared, I have seen so much around deficit thought for the last 2 years.
Yes.
What of our students the learning loss? And I'm guilty of doing that too, especially when it comes to algebra at our house. Just want to be real. But then if we can kind of look at that differently about what have our students gained, and you're right, some things that are going to really be a foundation for them, quite frankly, that might be even more helpful than algebra in their lives. We got a great question from James. What is the diversity of the students maybe that come to you for help, or the faculty in your classes? Because I know you're really working kind of more with faculty. I know you're teaching students as well. So thanks, James, for our question.
Yeah, thanks for that question. In terms of racial diversity, the Claremont Colleges are very much primarily white institutions. And that has been an object of continuing conversation, I'll just say that way, both in terms of further diversifying and supporting a diverse faculty, and supporting a more diverse student body. Where I find a lot of diversity, we have a lot of neurodiverse students in our classes, and a lot of neurodiverse faculty. We have a lot of gender diversity in the faculty and in the student body. My students are fantastic this way. Like the very first thing they'll do when we do first day introductions is they'll share their pronouns, and it has become sort of a hallmark of the colleges to really embrace a wide gender diversity, a wide spectrum of gender, and so that's been encouraging. We, in terms of socioeconomic diversity, that depends on the college, because while they're all private institutions and primarily white institutions, some colleges are better placed to support students from middle income or lower middle income households, and others are not. So that's kind of the ways we see and don't see diversity at the colleges that I'm at now. Quite a large number of first generation and college students as well.
Oh, wow. Well, thank you. I know James was with the Brotherhood Initiative, and I know that was important. We also have another question from Kristen. She's sharing that thought it was interesting what you shared earlier about students realizing they need each other more now and a communal sense of caring. She started to see this, the opposite of this during the year. Many of our students are quicker than they used to be to shut off friendships and relationships. And if something goes wrong, they seem to not want to discuss it or work things out. And that they're avoiding directly confronting anything, kind of extreme self-preservation. Any recommendations, or how do you recommend helping students kind of cope better with conflict? That's a good, because I think we're seeing this sort of nationally, like just within our own people. On all levels.
Thank you for that. And I'm sorry to hear that you're observing that. Because that is all. I agree. I think that may be just an act of self-preservation. It's another way that loss is manifested, right? I've lost people in my life, and I'm just not ready to create those spaces where I'm in that kind of pain again, right? So I'll just let it be. But in terms of what we can do as educators about that, I'm a big believer in spending time up front talking about what we will do when conflict happens. And this actually works for advisors too, right? RAs inevitably get to bear the brunt of some of this conflict. So framing it that way, I think, is really helpful, because it's not like, well, what if there is a conflict? That's not realistic to life. Conflict inevitably happens, right? So how are we preparing ourselves now so that when conflict inevitably does happen, we can respond in a healthy way, right? that doesn't further damage relationships. We spend a lot of time the first several weeks of my class building community guidelines, and saying, okay, when this kind of conflict happens, somebody says something that is harmful, what are we going to do? How are we going to stop that harm? How are we going to address it? What kinds of language are we going to use? How are we going to speak to that? And always starting with the idea that and it may not happen. I've actually had a pretty great go with my class this semester. But I think part of that was because we set it up to be a conflict aware space. Like, we know it's going to happen. That's just human relationships. And so making sure that we're making time to identify that. Again, this is about us not dismissing, right, what students have experienced, not sort of saying, oh, well, we'll be fine, because we won't be. And the other thing that's nice about that, of taking that time in the class, is it shows students that you actually really value their input, that you value their previous experiences, that you're not dismissing them. And it gives them choice and voice, right? That we set those community guidelines together, and they can then model that in other spaces.
Really love that. I know in my teaching training, AQ, the Association of College and University Educators, in their courses, that's one of the things they really talk about, is the importance of early on establishing those kinds of class norms, guidelines. I really loved how we're going to work together in community, our community guidelines. It's so important. Great suggestion that we can do really in lots of different community spaces. It doesn't have to be the classroom, right? In a residence hall, within a student organization, within our offices, as we're working with students. Well, Jessica, we've reached 12:45 Eastern time. Thank you so much for just a wealth of really wonderful information for us to kind of chew over, things that we can do immediately to help support our students this semester. And also a real way, I think, of reframing the end of this year, because I think a lot of us really need to remember not to look at it from that deficit perspective, to look at it from an asset perspective, and to remember to take care of ourselves too. As we wrap up this year, it has been a year, and we kind of have to get ready for the next one. So Pierre's asked a great question. Can we get a recording of this meeting? Absolutely, Pierre, that was my next transition. Thank you. So if you're a GoToKnowledge member, this will be available on your dashboard, but for everybody, Friday 5 Live is a podcast, and it can be found on any of your podcasting channels. So, and it can also be found on the Innovative Educators website as well. So we will make sure that we get the recording out to folks, but also know that, if you listen Apple Podcast or Spotify or where have you, you can find us there as well, Friday 5 Live, and it will be available. The recording will be available by Monday for everyone. So thank you so much, Jessica, for your time today. Thanks everybody for your questions and for our discussion. I hope everyone has a wonderful weekend. I hope there's time for rest and renewal as we enter these last weeks of our spring semester. We will be podcasting again on Friday, May the 15th. And one more Californian, Jessica, we're going to be talking with Kate Mueller in the community college system there in California. So about leadership and about student support. So always excited to have those conversations with our West Coast colleagues. Thank you guys so much. Everyone have a great weekend and take care.
Thanks everyone for being here. Really appreciate you. Thank you.
Thank you. We appreciate you.